Here in the UK, as I just started, is very limited litigation. And there's some research been done here in the UK over the last few years that I've pointed out to three main areas of concern. The first one is obviously high costs. Going to court here in the UK, as in Canada, is a very expensive business. So either you have very deep pockets or you don't do it. Then the second problem is a culture. Whereas in countries like Portugal, Spain, and Greece, it's a cultural thing to challenge a decision, and perhaps also in Sweden. Obviously. Here in the UK, it's not in the culture of private contractors to challenge the decisions. You can say that perhaps they're afraid of being blacklisted. There's no evidence that blacklists exist, but there's at least that urban myth that contractors should accept what happens in the procurement process and should take it or leave it and without complaining. And the third one coming from the culture is a perceived prejudice against complainants. So there's this perception that if you complain, you're going to be a troublemaker, you're seen as a troublemaker, so you're not going to be invited for future tenders, or you're going to be in any way affected or disaffected in future procurement procedures. So what that does tell us is, again, either the system is working very well or the system is too self-contained. So perhaps what the system needs here in the UK is a way to let off some steam so that people can actually vouch what's wrong with them, what the problems that they're facing in procurement without actually going through the court system and through the judicial reviews. Meanwhile, in the Kingdom of Denmark, they have created a few years ago something called the Public Procurement Complaint Boards. So they created, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that, and they were revised in 2010. And they have an administrative nature, so they're not courts as we know them here, they're not part of the court structure or the judiciary, they are administrative tribunals, which are cheaper and easier to run and provide provide bidders with means of redress. In fact, they're actually the first instance of appeal since 2010 for any situation or any case or any issue until the standstill period. So after the standstill period and the contract is awarded, then they have to go directly to courts. If it's before that, then they need to go through the Public Procurement Complaints Board. Their powers are roughly equivalent to what you'd find on the judiciary, on the courts. So they can grant interim measures, they can set aside decisions, they can establish that laws or rules have been broken, and they can even award damages. So that's a novelty from 2010 as well. So in a sense, they function almost as courts without being courts. Interestingly, they manage and they're staffed with people that are very well reputed in Denmark in the field of public procurement. So you've got former judges, you've got university professors, so you've got people that know about the trades, analyzing the cases that cases go through the complaints boards. One of the questions that I sent to Professor Steentruymer was the numbers. So everyone loves stats, everyone loves numbers. So I asked them what I've been doing over the last few years, and the feedback that I got directly from the horse's mouth from the Danish procurement boards was that the complaints have been holding more or less steadily. So they had 182 new cases in 2010, and in 2012 they had 161. Perhaps the trend is slightly lower numbers than in previous years. The duration of the process, as Helen has said very well, takes around between 6 to 8 months, so around 200 days to 250 days. In any case, it's long, but it's much shorter than a traditional judicial review. I mean, in Portugal, cases that I've worked on almost 10 years ago, they're still clogged up in the court system. So we're still waiting for a final decision on those cases. Their budget is very small. So they deal with almost 200 cases a year, but the budget is around £500,000. And out of those £500,000, around £100,000 are the fees that they charge to the contractors. To the complainants, so they're going to be the contractors. Interestingly, the contractors can be redressed of their fees, including receiving some money that pays towards legal costs. So they do not pay the full legal costs of the complainants, but they actually pay part of it if they are successful. Now, that's in Denmark. In the UK, there's something called the mystery shopper, which I think is a misnomer, because when you think about the mystery shopper, and I was talking with Frank early this afternoon, you think about someone that is going to use the service anonymously, but is reporting back and is making an analysis of the service. That's not what we have here in the UK. What you have here in the UK with the mystery shopper is basically someone that raises a complaint with the central government, and then the central government, the Cabinet Office, allocates a case worker to check on with the contracting authority what happened. So this is fairly new, was only introduced in 2011. covers the whole of the UK. So yes, Welsh contracting authorities, you're also covered. So you may receive a call one day from these caseworkers, and they operate on a system whereby they follow up on concerns raised by complainants. However, the only thing that they can do is making suggestions. So they don't even have the power to ask the contracting authorities to comply with the request for information, for example. So they don't have unfettered access to information. They cannot go and say, I want to see your documentation. They depend entirely on the goodwill and the ability of the contracting authority to cooperate with the mystery shopper. And as I said, the complaints can be anonymous, and generally they are anonymous. Their scope was originally very limited to only to analyzing poor procurement practices, but since, again, procurement is a vehicle so that you can shoehorn more and more stuff into it, the poor mystery shopper service has been expanded to include also supply chain issues. So, for example, they can now check if payments are being made to subcontractors, if they're being made on time, and also if the main contractors in the procurement, if they're opening supply chain opportunities. In a sense, we can almost say that the mystery shopper functions as a monitoring tool of procurement policy, because all this is about the procurement policy that has been set by central government and not by other procurement authorities. Procurement is a devolved power in UK, so Scotland even has their own regulations, whereas Wales has the common regulations with England, but they have their own procurement system. So how does it work? Well, it usually starts with a complaint, like everything else. A case is opened, the contracting authority is contacted, suggestions are made, and then the contracting authority decides if they want to take them on board or not. Again, there's no penalty if the contracting authority decides not to do so, and the reports are not made public, so you don't know which ones were dragged over the coals and which ones refused to accept the suggestions. And after that, the process is closed. So far, according to data from the Cabinet Office, the main issues assessed have been PQQs, surprise, surprise, procurement strategy, transparency, ITTs, and some others, which I've put in the red bit there, which includes also frameworks. On the procurement strategy, it includes pre-procurement engagement, consortium subcontracting, and also the specifications. So it's pretty much around the way that the process operates and the way that things are run at the process level. In terms of numbers, they had 300 cases open in less than 18 months, which is a good number for the UK. 78 were concluded positively, whatever that means, because the report does not explain what positively means. So I suppose it was drafted by a bureaucrat, Frank, in your parlor. As I said, 80% are related to the procurement process, and the split so far is 30% of the complaints are about central government procurement, and the rest, the other 70 are about other procurement entities or about the supply chain issues, which are only 10%. Now, Scotland's single point of inquiry. It's older than the mystery shopper. It was created in 2008. And the way it works is that they follow up on complaints from bidders or prospective bidders. So you don't need to actually have bidded on a contract to raise a complaint. So you may be, for example, a trade association. You can say, well, look, it's happening this in this market, which is my market, and the Scottish government should do something about it. So trade associations are entitled to actually raise complaints. Interestingly, it goes a little bit further than the mystery shopper, because through the single point of inquiry, they can actually broker disputes through a non-confrontational means. So it's not an official ADR, it's not anything that is official, but they can try and smooth over the rough edges and get people to dialogue and get people to solve their problems together. And on a recent review in 2001, they decided to create a steering group, which they call the Single Point of Inquiry Champions, which again brings on all the stakeholders that are relevant for this service. So it's not only the public sector but also private sector. So again, trade associations and trade representations. They bring them together to help develop the service further, so that they get buy-in from both sides, from the procurers and also the suppliers. So basically, its scope is pretty much limited to complaints by suppliers or trade associations. They can provide procurement advice to suppliers on procurement matters. So a little bit like it happens in Canada. If you don't know how the process is done, you can call them up and ask for help how the process is done. So I think it's very good to help companies that are getting into the procurement game to develop their capabilities. And then they use the data that they gather to feed it back into the procurement system. So they recycle the data and then try to act on it to improve policy going forward. At least theoretically, that's the scope. In terms of numbers, they're much lower than the UK because they only cover, the mystery shopper, because they only cover Scotland. So they had 160 cases open in 3.5 years. I've tried to analyze the data. The data is, again, not entirely clear, but it seems that in 38% of those cases, there was no change, so nothing happened. But at least 24% led to significant changes in the procurement process. They led to, for example, changes in the way that the process was being run, or even a full restart of the tendering procedure. Again, as in Canada, main users are SMEs, so it's no surprise. And so for the local authorities here, 71% of the complaints were related to local authorities. Now, will that map out to Wales? I don't know. But that's the situation in Scotland. In terms of what are the main issues that are assessed, I've divided this on a more simple format. Tender process, PQQ again, and others. So on the tender process, we've got the specifications, the award criteria, and even the way that award criteria and bids are scored. And for the PQQ, it's just the PQQ in itself. I find very surprising, coming from, again, a different jurisdiction, the love affair that UK contracting authorities have with PQQs, because the UK is the only member state where the restricted procedure is actually more popular than the open procedure, the only one. So I'm yet to find an answer for this idiosyncrasy of the UK in general. So it's not only in England, it's not only in Wales or in Scotland, it's the UK in general. Now, looking at these two systems in the UK, the mystery shopper and the single point of inquiry, what they are not, formal. Whereas the Canadian Procurement Ombudsman, it's a formal process. It is backed by law. It is backed by a mandate. The mystery shopper and the single point of inquiry, they're basically trying to solve the problem from the bottom up by creating something that works instead of creating something that is set from the top to solve a bigger problem. What they do not provide either is real means of redress. So if you make a complaint to the mystery shopper or to the single point of inquiry, you're not going to solve your problem. So you may improve, in general, not going to solve your problem. You may improve the procurement practice. You may improve how that contracting authority is going to behave in the future. But more often than not, as you've seen by the numbers, nothing happens to your personal situation. Then it's not enforceable or binding, which again means that both services depend on the goodwill of the contracting authorities to cooperate. So if they decide that they don't want to cooperate, there's nothing that can be done. Whereas with the Canadian Procurement Ombudsman, again, if I'm correct, please correct me, Frank, if I'm wrong. The cooperation is mandatory.
It depends, Pedro, on what aspect of my mandate. If I find that the supplier has been unfairly treated, and the supplier's out of pocket, I can recommend, the regulations say I can recommend to the department compensation for the bidding cost. There's nothing in regulation that makes it mandatory for them to pay the bidding cost, but we operate on something called soft power.
Yeah.
Knowing that the Ombudsman is recommending and may publish the fact that the department was not willing to cooperate, typically leads departments to cooperate. It's soft power.
But my comment is, when you're doing your investigation, they have to cooperate at that stage.
There's a requirement in regulations that they provide
exactly. The documentation, access to materials. That's what I mean.
Yes.
Here in the UK, you don't have that. You don't even have that. That's what I meant by enforceable or binding. So not at the end. And then they're not general. So they are one-offs. They are stuff that gets done a little bit under the radar. So there's no generalization done afterwards. Whereas in other countries like Canada, when problems are flagged, they're investigated fully, and then perhaps guidance and guidelines are made for future changes. At this moment in time, what happens with the mystery shopper and the single point of inquiry pretty much stays within that system. So to finish off, I would like to leave you with a question. I don't know if I have time to answer it or not in the Q&A. Are the mystery shopper and the single point of inquiry, the escape valves needed? I would like to ask this directly, particularly to the people from the private sector in the room. So I like to create stir some controversy here. So I would like to discuss this question now in the Q&A if possible. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm open to questions.